Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria, but also Eastern Antique Arms, linked below to my website. And I obviously talk about antique swords a lot on this channel, and here we're going to look at another model of antique British sword that we sometimes encounter. They're not that common, and I don't think I've explicitly talked about them in the past. This is the 1827 Royal Navy officer's sword. So first of all, the hilt is still the model that's in use today. So if you see, for example, pictures of someone like Prince Charles or someone else, some notable person who's been in the Royal Navy, you'll see that they carry a sword with a hilt very, very similar to this. You'll notice it has a solid brass guard. It's a similar type of design, what's known as the Gothic design, that's originally used for the infantry officers' swords, the 1822 pattern originally. And what they've done is they've filled in the gaps. So usually these bits here are cutouts. Just bring it closer to the camera for you. So usually these bits in here that are sort of stippled are usually cut out in the infantry model of sword, and it's filled in the navy sword. And you will also notice that it's got an anchor, a fouled anchor under a crown, which is obviously the symbol of the Royal Navy. You'll also notice that the pommel is rather characteristic because it's a lion's head. In this case, you'll notice that it is biting the bottom of the guard. So the knuckle bow, as it were, or guard, comes round into the lion's mouth and it's biting it there. That does change in later models. There's some overlap. So in the Victorian period, you get some lions are biting the end of the guard, and then in the sort of medium to late Victorian period, they sometimes start fitting the guard underneath the chin of the lion, and that is these days the predominant way that the guard comes in. Not necessarily a particular reason for why. I suspect it's easier to manufacture. This was probably a bit more fiddly to fit, and so they decided an easier way to manufacture these things was to have the guard coming underneath the lion's chin instead of into its bared teeth. The lion pommel, we first start seeing that on Royal Navy swords officially from about 1805, but we actually do see it on some non-regulation examples earlier than that. The lion head pommel, incidentally, was emulated by certain other nations, for example Prussia, and in fact this sword as a whole was emulated. So you do see other nations' navies, and not even just navies, sometimes even cavalry and stuff, using elements of their sword design which are based partly on British swords. So this sword came in and replaced the 1805 pattern sword, which was a spadroon fundamentally. And as you guys know, if you watch this channel, there was a general tendency around 1820 to switch from spadroons, where spadroons were still in use, at least in the British military, wasn't the same all around Europe. But there was a general tendency around 1820 to switch from spadroons to sabres, and this is a sabre. We'll look at the blade in a minute because the blade's quite characteristic. So this hilt used the Gothic hilt inspired by the infantry officer's sword, 1822 pattern. This was 5 years later, 1827. It kept the lion pommel of the earlier Royal Navy swords, and it has a grip. In this case, you'll notice that the grip is dark. Okay, so that's dark shagreen. Shagreen, so it's a type of shark, probably dogfish, we think, with brass or copper alloy wire around. So this grip is actually very similar to the in fact, it's practically identical to the infantry officer's grip. And in that case, this probably means that this is either for a junior officer or perhaps for a man-at-arms, so someone in charge of gunnery, usually on a ship. More superior officers or just general Royal Navy officers had a white grip. So if you look at most Royal Navy swords today, for example Prince Charles's, you'll notice that the grips look white. It's not that this has gone grey, it's that this was never white because this is for a different rank or a different purpose. Okay, if it's got a white grip, then it's for a general sort of Royal Navy officer, and that is a different type. We think that's ray skin, and that was specifically chosen to be white. So the main differences to the infantry hilt are lion pommel, filled in gaps in the Gothic guard, and usually a white grip rather than the grey grip, although some of them do have a grey grip. The folding section on the inside, so you'll notice just the same as the 1822 and the subsequent 1845 infantry officer's sword, it has a folding section. This is purely to make it more comfortable to wear. Some of them are made without that folding section and the guard is made solid. I've had a couple of examples through my collection like this, and it's clear that this is a weak point when you have a hinge there. And so the ones where it's made solid, it could be for economic reasons, but it seems that usually they're associated with kind of more fighty swords. So officers who wanted a sword that was a little bit more robust often had, instead of a folding section there, a fixed section. Now we should mention that folding section on Royal Navy swords, it doesn't on this one, because this is an early one, this is an 1827, but on later Royal Navy swords there is often a hole in this section here and a peg on the guard there, and the hull engages with the peg on the guard such that you can't pull the sword out when the flap is down. That's specific to Royal Navy swords. There are some other swords in the world that have a similar thing, but in the British military that's specific to Royal Navy swords, because Royal Navy officers, for many reasons, often carried their swords. But in addition to carrying their swords, usually upside down as well, a bit like a katana, as well as carrying their swords, they were often climbing up and down things, including climbing down into rowing boats and climbing up ladders and all this kind of stuff. And so therefore they absolutely didn't want a sword that if you did that, it might fall out of the scabbard. And of course, if you're at sea and your sword falls out of its scabbard, it might not just fall on the floor or the deck, it might fall into the water and it's gone, okay? And if you're far out at sea, you stand no chances of getting a new sword. You'd have to use one of the cutlasses from the ship. So, for many reasons, you want that to be a locking mechanism. But on these early ones, they don't yet have that locking mechanism. That comes in, I believe, maybe around 1840, 1850, I think that starts to become common. So this sword's probably from the late 1820s, so 1827 through the 1830s. Okay, we know it definitely dates before 1846. Right, so locking mechanism. The other thing, you'll notice this has a standard sword knot hole. Again, this is an early example. Later examples have two holes up here as well, and the sword knot is knotted through in a somewhat complex fashion that's quite different to army swords, that is, infantry, cavalry, artillery, Royal Engineers, who only have the sword knot hole up here. Royal Navy swords later get holes down here, but as mentioned, this is an early example, so it doesn't have it. So this is a sort of pure and very good example of an 1827, because it doesn't yet have some of the later adaptations that were brought into Royal Navy officers' swords that are there still today and were there throughout the Victorian period. This is pre-Victorian. Probably maybe end of George IV's reign or William IV. Probably more likely William IV. Right, so next up we're going to talk about I'm not going to talk about the scabbards today because that's a somewhat complex and understudied topic, but generally speaking we find scabbards. This has got two rings as you'd find usually on an army sword, but you do find examples which don't have that mount and simply have a mount up here. It can sometimes be one ring, sometimes it can be two rings on either side, and sometimes there can be a frog. So it's just various different ways of wearing the scabbard, and that largely relates to the rank of the officer and the type of uniform and sword belt he wears, but it also relates to the precise period you're talking about, because they kept changing uniforms and changing scabbards and sword belts, and some people kept the old way, some people updated the new one. So you find lots of different scabbard options with these. But one overall thing to say about Royal Navy scabbards is that they were and remain leather and brass. Okay, so whereas in the army they started out with leather and brass scabbards and moved, generally speaking, to metal scabbards, either steel or brass, in the Navy they kept leather and brass scabbards, and they are still today. Okay, they are still made of essentially three bits of brass on a leather, bendy leather, there's no liner in it, scabbard. Right. Finally, let's have a little look at the blade. So the blade is quite characteristic. As I mentioned, this replaced the 1805 pattern, which was a spadroon. The blade on the 1805 spadroon was similar to the 1796 infantry officer's spadroon. So it was a back edge, in other words, blunt on the back, sharp on the front with a small false edge at the point. But this was entirely different. Okay, as you can see, it's a broad blade. I'm just going to put the scabbard down. One thing about drawing these scabbards, if you're ever looking at antique examples, don't hold them horizontally when you draw the sword out, because the leather will suddenly flop and bend, and that's how you end up with cracked and broken scabbards, and that's how you end up with them being lost and thrown away and things like this. So always hold the scabbard downwards, make sure that you have disengaged any locking mechanism that there might be, and then draw the sword upwards and the scabbard downwards. Okay, that's how you maintain, and then keep the scabbard downwards and carefully lay it down on a flat surface. Remember that this is leather which is at this point nearly 200 years old, okay, and I can assure you when your leather on your body is 200 years old, it will not be in as good condition as that scabbard, okay, hopefully, unless it's some strange embalming process. Right, so the blade, very characteristic. So first things to say about it, it's not terribly long. But it's not terribly short either. It's longer than a cutlass. So a cutlass at this time usually had a 27 to 29 inch blade. This is a 31 inch blade. Okay, these naval swords are usually slightly shorter than an army officer's sword. So an army officer's sword in Britain was a standard 32.5 inches. I'm using imperial measurements because that's what they used. Okay, you can do the conversion on Google. So 32.5 inches was standard from the Napoleonic period right the way through. In fact, it's still standard today. So 32.5 inches is standard for an infantry officer. The standard for Navy officers was, I believe, 31 inches. In fact, it varies a bit. You find some examples are more like 30 inches, some are more like 31.5, but they are not very often as long as infantry officers' swords. They are shorter. Why might you want a shorter sword at sea? Well, quite clearly because ships then were very confined spaces. So whether you're on board deck, where there's lots of other people on board deck fighting and doing whatever they need to do, whether you're climbing in and out of boats, climbing up and down ladders, or whether you're going down steps down below decks, or if you are below decks, whether you're fighting or not fighting, a long blade is an encumbrance and a shorter blade is more convenient. Okay, so it's longer than a cutlass but not as long as an army officer's sword, and it's a pipe back blade. Now you will notice this particular blade is quite broad. Okay, it's about 1.5 inches at the base, and it has a flared, what we would call yeoman, if we take it, because these were inspired by Turkish swords, by the pala or kilic, and this flared yeoman or false edge is specific as a specific design which was pioneered and originally produced pretty much exclusively by John Prosser of Charing Cross, London. Okay, now Prosser was a sword maker, pretty much the top level, was certainly one of the top level sword makers in the early part of the 19th century, and before essentially Wilkinson kind of became the most famous sword making company from the middle of the 1840s. So from about the sort of 1800, 1810, right the way through to the middle of the 1840s, Prosser were pretty much the top level maker in Britain, and they pioneered this style of pipe back blade. Now, just to give a little bit of credit there to John Prosser, Prosser was therefore the founding father, as far as we know, of this style of pipe back blade, particularly, but not only, with a flared yeoman, but pipe back blades in general. Now, pipe back blades were emulated all over Europe. They were used in Austria or in Prussia, and in fact, even up until the First World War, pipe back blades were still being used on some regulation models of sword. For example, the German 1889 cavalry sword used a pipe back blade, and we should therefore point out that all comes, as far as we know, from Prosser. It may have been that there were some prototypes of it around before Prosser started using it, but Prosser made that type of blade famous. So in 1827, they were already using a pipe back blade for the army officer's sword, so they went for a similar pipe back blade for the navy officer's sword, but they made a couple of differences. The navy officer's sword tends to be broader. Now, I should say, this is in my collection, this sword, and this is a particularly broad example. Hence, I've kept it because I really like it. I am not the world's biggest fan of pipe back blades, functionally speaking, except when they are robust. And my opinion is that pipe back blades are good when they're made broad. And I have a few very broad pipe back blades, Prossers, in my collection, and broad pipe back blades seem to work very well. When you make them narrow, they don't work very well because they're no longer stiff enough, they no longer have enough kind of beef and mass to them. So anyway, a broad pipe-back blade I like, and that's what they put on this particular example. You do get narrower examples, but the tendency seems to be for Navy officers' swords to be broader than Army officers' swords, and shorter, of course. So the weight is about the same. They shortened them and widened them. And the Navy officer's sword has this very flared yeoman at the back, whereas the Army officer's sword, although you do get some with this, generally speaking, they do not. Okay, so imagine this blade without that flared bit at the back. That's more like the Army officer's sword. So shorter, broader, flared yeoman. This is the 1827 pattern Royal Navy officer's blade, and that's the hilt that goes with it, this being an early example. This was used until 1846. In 1845, Henry Wilkinson came along. In fact, in 1844, Henry Wilkinson came along and essentially revised and renovated all of the British Army's kind of view of swords. He introduced a new fullard model of sword, which is still the model of blade which is regulation in the Royal Navy today. And it's the type of sword that you'll see on most of the Victorian swords that I show on this channel. It has a fuller for about the first 2/3 or 3/4, and then is essentially a double-edged blade for the point, for the last kind of 8 or 10 inches. And that came in as regulation for Royal Navy officers, so new officers coming in when they were buying their swords, that was the new type of sword they would then start buying in 1846. That's not to say that this model of sword became banned or illegal or something. So officers who'd been in the Royal Navy up until 1846 would still have their swords like this predating that. So say, for example, the person who bought this sword in 1830 went on to become a captain by 1850 or maybe 1854, the Crimean War. He probably still would have had this sword and still would have worn it. And we know that these flared yeoman pipe-back 1827 patterns were still in use in the Crimean War because they're shown in photographs and paintings. And they were still in use at the time of the Indian Mutiny in 1857-58. And in fact, we know that they're shown in paintings, they're shown in pictures. And for example, William Peel, VC, who won the Victoria Cross, son of Robert Peel, a famous painting shows him with a sword like this. It's a pre-1846 pattern. His is actually interesting, and it's a hybrid. And I'll just very briefly mention those hybrids. I've had a couple through my collection, which unfortunately I've sold and I don't have to hand. But before the fullard blade came in for, or around the time that the fullard blade came in for Henry Wilkinson's new design in 1846, some people accepted that the fullard blade had to be in there to meet with regulations, or because that was the newest thing and that was just fashionable, whatever. But they wanted to maintain this very flared yeoman. And so the sword that we actually know belonged to Captain Peel, VC, actually had a fuller at the base. It wasn't pipe-backed, it had a fuller and a flared blade. So there was a hybrid blade, but they were never really regulation, and they certainly weren't made in large numbers or for very long, because very few of them survive. I have seen, I think, 3 or 4 in my entire collecting career, and I've only owned 2, and I sold them both, unfortunately. So there we go. Generally speaking, this sword was replaced in 1846 by the new fullard blade, the Wilkinson style blade. Do I like it as a sword? Hell yeah, I love it. It's a really nice sword. It's got a very fine edge. It's not the most robust sword in the world because it's very thin, like it's very, because it's a pipe back, it's got a very thin cross section here. But they are broad, they look awesome, they've got a good guard. It's brass, not steel, but it's a good guard for a brass guard. They've got a lovely grip, they've got a nice big pommel on the back. It just moves really nice. And one little detail of pipe back blades, I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, they make a real swoosh when you cut them through the air. Okay, it's just something about pipe back blades and the type of cross section they have. So there we go, the 1827 Royal Navy officer's sword, 1827 to 1846. Lovely things. They're not massively rare, but the kind of particularly broad examples are a little bit rarer. And if you can get hold of one, if you're a British sword collector, I recommend you to get one because they're really nice things. And personally, I much prefer them to the post-1846 Royal Navy officers' swords. They somehow seem a bit more like fighting weapons to me, but yeah, I love them. Would I want to use one against a cutlass? Not so sure. But we do know that some Royal Navy officers actually used cutlasses instead of their swords in actual combat. But we equally know that these were used in combat as well, because we see them in, well, they're described in sources, but they're also shown even on campaign in photographs and paintings and stuff like this. Anyway, thank you for watching. And I will see you really soon for another video on some other random sword-related subject. Cheers for watching. Click like and subscribe if you haven't already. And see you soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.